Hello there everyone and welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing really well. I am so excited to sit down and film today's video because it's one that I've never done before over here on my channel, and that is reviewing all of the books that I read in 2022. I ended up reading a total of 16 books, which I know isn't loads in comparison to some people, but for me to go from 0 to 16 was something that I was really happy about. And so I thought it would be a nice idea for me to sit down and go through all of the books that I read, review them with you all, let you know what I thought about them. I do this over on my Goodreads, so after I finish every single book I do put a little mini review on my Goodreads with the star rating, but I know that not many people use that app, so I feel like it's just for me to keep track. You can go and follow me over there if you want to, the link is in the description box, but I thought that this video, to sum it all up, would be really nice to film. Before we begin, please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe down below, and other than that, let's get into it, shall we? I don't have physical copies of all of the books that I read last year anymore, partly because a lot of them from the earlier stages of the year have already been passed on or sold, but I do have half of them. I've managed to find 8 books that are still on my bookshelf. But the first book that I read in 2022 was The Beekeeper of Aleppo by Christy Left-Eary, and this is one of those books that has stuck with me ever since. If you've never heard of it before, I don't want to give too many spoilers in case you all go and read the books that I recommend in this video, but I will give a brief summary of each book. So this is about 2 Syrian refugees, a husband and a wife, who make their journey from Syria across to Europe, and it was incredibly emotional and it was incredibly gripping. I also really loved the mental health twist at the end. So if you're interested in learning more about those journeys that people take, if you're interested in mental health, if you're interested in the effects that being a refugee can have on people, this book was incredibly insightful. I just find that reading books like this really helps me to connect with other people on a day-to-day basis. It expands my knowledge of the world, it expands my knowledge of politics, it really does deepen that level of understanding, and this book really did that for me, and I'm so grateful that I read it. Overall, I rated this book 4 stars out of 5, and the reason I did that is because the chapters skip between past and present. So when the author's writing the book, she's writing it from the perspective of they've already come across to Europe. So one chapter will be about the past, about their journey, and the other chapter, like the next one along, will be about them already being there. So that was a little bit confusing at the start and it took some time to get to grips with, but once I'd done that, I did thoroughly enjoy the book. The next book of 2022 was Grace is Gone by Emily Algar, and I read this book in 3 days straight, which is incredibly quick for me. I didn't realise before starting it that it very closely mirrors the storyline or the experiences of Gypsy Rose and Dee Dee Blanchard. If you're not familiar with that case, it's essentially a mother who made her daughter sick, and that is what this book encaptures, in addition to a murder mystery twist as well. So it made sure that you explored that side of things with the medical side, but it also explored the murder, and because of the combination of the two, I found it incredibly gripping and such an easy read, hence why I read it so quickly. Again, I rated this book 4 out of 5 stars, and the only reason I did that is because I noticed some inaccuracies around Munchausen syndrome and fictitious disorder imposed on another. There were a few inaccuracies inside of the book, but overall it's a really nice introduction to the illness, and it was a really gripping book. I would highly recommend. Next up we have It's Not About the Burqa by Mariam Khan, and my reflections on this book are slightly similar to the first one. This was a great way for me to learn more about the experiences of Muslim women and the challenges that they face within their communities and within the world. As someone who has never experienced that, I find it really interesting to delve into that culture and delve into that religion and learn more about it, and as a woman, sympathise and empathise with them as well. Essentially it was 17 chapters within the book, and each chapter was written by a different lady who shared a slightly different experience. So some of the chapters were focused on sexism, some were focused on gender roles, some were focused on sex, and I found all of that really interesting because we all have such different experiences in the world, and I love learning about other people's. Because of that, it might be surprising for you to hear that I only rated this book 3 out of 5 stars, and I do feel a little bit bad about this, but I think it's just a reflection of me personally, because towards the end of the book some of the chapters included a little bit of repetition or just felt repetitive as a reader. I lost my interest at times. I feel like I'm really hard to impress with that. Unless a book is very gripping and very captivating, my interest does dip massively. Okay, so I now have my first physical copy of a book that I can share with you all. This is one that is never, ever, ever gonna leave our shelf. We're never gonna give this up. And the book is called It's All in Your Head by Suzanne O'Sullivan. Now, Suzanne O'Sullivan is a neurologist, and in this book she speaks about her experiences working with people with psychosomatic conditions. If you've not heard of those before, then I have just quickly loaded up the Google definition because I don't want to spread any misinformation. But according to Google, psychosomatic disorders are physical illnesses or other conditions caused or aggravated by a mental factor such as internal conflict or stress. And I thoroughly enjoyed all of the case studies that were explored within here. I thought they were gripping, I thought that they were interesting. I learned a hell of a lot from this book, and it was the first book of the year that I rated 5 out of 5 stars, which again, I'm quite tough to please. So if I'm rating something 5 stars, you know it's good, so go and pick this up if you are interested in giving it a read. Next on my list is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. I will say before we get into this that this book comes with the longest list of trigger warnings that I have ever seen, and so if you are thinking about reading it, I highly recommend that you read those before you do. But as a result of that, I found this book equally as heartbreaking and soul shattering as I did gripping. It was a really tough read, and it's something that I still think about to this day from time to time. I think because the author spends so long making you feel really connected to the characters when bad things start happening to them and when they experience just the most horrific things, it really just knocks you down and makes you feel like you're there with them. What I didn't realise before starting this book was that even though it focuses on a group of friends, the main focus and the main character is just one of those. It's the character called Jude. It still focuses on the friendship group around him and the family that he comes to love, but it doesn't necessarily focus as much on their experiences. It focuses on their experiences linked to Jude, if that makes sense. And so for me, that was one of the reasons why I only rated it 4 out of 5 stars. The other reason is slightly because of what I mentioned earlier. Like I said, she spends so long building up these characters, and for me, I found it quite hard to get into for the first 150 to 200 pages, which any other book, I wouldn't finish it, but because I knew what was to come in this, I stuck with it. It was a hefty book. I think it's like 700 and something pages, so it's a massive read, and that's kind of why I stuck with it, but it was quite hard to get into, and that's why I rated it 4 out of 5 stars. My next book of 2022 was Inside Broadmoor by Jonathan Levi and Emma French, and this was quite an easy read for me. As someone that's always been quite interested in mental health, I've got my fair share of knowledge about places like Broadmoor. I work in secure hospitals, and so I feel like it was quite a familiar book for me in some ways. But I did still find this quite an interesting read. There was some information in there that I'd never heard of before, and so I found it interesting to learn more about it, such as Jimmy Savile's involvement with the hospital. I never ever knew that was a thing, and it's something that the book goes into quite a bit of detail about. I did only rate this book 3 out of 5 stars again, probably because I already have knowledge on it. If I didn't have knowledge, it would be great to delve into, and it really is informative. But because of that, I did find some parts quite repetitive, and I already knew some, so I found myself skim reading through some parts. And my only other criticism is that it didn't go into as much detail on patient experiences as I thought it would, and I think from what I remember, some of the other reviews on Goodreads said that same thing. We thought it would explore the patient experience a little bit more, but I suppose the focus was more on the hospital itself, the staff, a little bit about the patients, and you know, how things work, the history, which again is still really interesting, but not quite what I expected when I picked up the book. I don't know if I would really recommend it. I think there are better books, but for me it was a nice easy read and something that I still learned a little bit from. Next up we have Three Sisters by Heather Morris, and if you've not heard of this, again, I don't know where you've been, but it's the 3rd book in the series. The first one is A Tattooist of Auschwitz, the second one is Silke's Journey, and the 3rd one is this one, The Three Sisters, and each book has a slightly different focus, but all of the characters are linked, and there is a crossover between every single book, which I really like because it feels like a continuation of a journey. journey, and it allows you to explore their experiences that little bit deeper. This one focuses on one of the main characters from the previous books as well as her sisters, and so it looks at the journey of these 3 sisters and tells you about what it was like. And I really wanted to rate this book a little bit higher, but I did only end up giving it 3.5 stars out of 5. The main highlight for me was learning a little bit more about what their life was like after the war, because I think that's often skimmed over in books about Auschwitz, which does make my downside of the book seem a little bit harsh, because I'm now about to tell you that I felt that some of the parts when they were within the camps felt a little bit rushed. I felt like there were some key parts within the book that should have been explored a little bit more. The other thing that was missing, which is the main reason why it's only got 3.5 stars for me, was my emotional connection to the characters within. Now, in the first 2 books, I was brought to tears both times at different points during the book because I felt so emotionally connected to the characters and it had a massive impact on me. But in this one, I just didn't get that as much. So I would say overall, if you've read the first 2 books in the series, this one is worth it because it continues that story. But if you're just starting out and you only want to read this one, I wouldn't recommend it as much. I'm going to be honest with you guys here and admit that I almost took this book off my list to tell you guys about in this video because I feel like an absolute savage for the review and the star rating that I am about to give this, but this was my worst read of 2022, and the reason I feel bad about it is because I 100% stand behind the cause, but the book itself was just quite poor in my opinion. The book is No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference by Greta Thunberg, and that's why I feel so bad about dragging it through the mud, but I rated this book 1 star, and that's only because I wasn't able to rate it 0 stars. And I don't know if that's an unpopular opinion or not, but the focus of this book is on different speeches that Greta has made throughout, a certain period of time. And although I really enjoyed the first one, like the first chapter, I was like, yes, I love this book, every single chapter after that just felt so repetitive. I even picked up towards the end that some of the exact same sentences had been repeated from the very beginning, and I think that should be expected really because it is a direct quote from her speeches, and so she is going to repeat herself at times, of course, but as someone that's reading the book, it doesn't really do much to maintain that interest. Next up, we have The Defining Decade by Meg J. Again, I don't have a physical copy of it, but this book is all about life in your 20s, why your 20s really matter and how you can make the most out of them. And I do apologise because this book hasn't stuck with me too much in my head, but I believe Meg J is some sort of therapist, and within this book she shares their stories whilst also linking that to life in your 20s. And whilst I was really excited to read this book, unfortunately my first introduction to self-help books with this book was not a good one. I personally found that her explanations of the client stories that she's worked with were quite judgmental, and I also found that because of the affluency of some of the clients that she worked with and because of herself, a lot of it was quite unrelatable to the average 20-year-old, or at least to myself. But for me that wasn't necessarily the worst part because I can accept that we've all got different backgrounds and I do find it interesting learning about other people's. The worst part for me that really brought this book down was the fact that this book focused on 3 different sections, and I can't remember them all, but one of them was your relationships and the relationships that you have within your 20s. And whilst that could have been a really interesting read and a really interesting focus, I found that chapter incredibly heteronormative, and as someone that is part of the LGBTQ community, it just doesn't sit right with me. And even if I wasn't part of that community, it still doesn't sit right with me. It wasn't very inclusive at all, and so as a result of the author's judgments and also the heteronormativity, I rated this book 2 out of 5 stars. I think if you're after self-help books and you want to know more about this topic, there must be more inclusive books out there that you can read that are more relatable, so I would direct you towards those. But next up we have Do No Harm by Henry Marsh, and again, Dr. Henry Marsh is a neurologist, he's a brain surgeon. This book for me was beautifully written. Each chapter again focuses on a different patient experience, and each chapter specifically focuses on a different type of brain tumour that the doctor has operated on or worked with within his career. And so that was able to really maintain my interest throughout, and also made sure that I learned a lot, because this isn't really a topic that I've read much about. My only criticisms of it is that he seemed to focus on cases where things went slightly wrong for him, and I do think that that is a disservice to his work, because he's done some incredible things as well, and you do see that more when you read the second book, which I will come on to in a little bit. And then my other criticism is that the terminology in here is obviously all correct, or I would assume it is correct, but it did go a little bit over my head at times. That's not necessarily a reflection of the book at all, like being bad. It's a reflection of my own knowledge and how that needs to be developed. So I was really grateful to have that opportunity, but it just meant that it was a slower read for me, and one that took a little bit more thinking. It wasn't as easy of a read. But overall, I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars, and it was enough for me to read his second book straight after, which I feel like I've never done before. And this book was slightly different to the first one, because it had a lot more focus on his personal life and things that he's done as kind of his reaching the age of retirement and after he's retired. And I'm not usually a massive fan of that, but for whatever reason, I actually found it really interesting, and I still thoroughly enjoyed it. The only thing that I didn't really like with this book is that I found some parts of it a little bit jumpy and poorly structured. It seemed to flick quite quickly between the time that he spent in Nepal and the time that he spent in Ukraine, and I think I would prefer to read about those experiences in different chapters rather than them being mushed together. So for that reason, I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars as well. So both of these books got 4 out of 5 stars from me, but again, a lot of my criticisms of them are just down to personal preference and reading style and lack of knowledge. So I would recommend these to anyone that is interested, because I did really enjoy them. Next up, we have The Child That Books Built by Frances Spufford, and I picked this book up, and I'm going to admit it, I judged it by its cover, and unfortunately, because I didn't do any research into it or read any reviews, and I just picked it up because I thought it was pretty, this was the first ever book that I DNF'd or did not finish. I just think that if I was 10 years older, I could relate a little bit more to the book and find it more enjoyable. What this book does really well is explore the literature and explore popular books from that time period, but again, I feel like it's a little bit old for me. So the books that it was going into and talking about, I'd never even heard of or I'd never read. I did enjoy the psychological parts of it. There are some parts of this book that go into the psychology of reading, and so for that reason, I did give it 2 out of 5 stars. Like I say, I didn't completely finish it, so I feel like I can't really give an accurate rating, but if you're my age, I don't think this book is really relevant. Kind of on the opposite side to that, we have my next read, which is The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. Now, I assume most people have heard of this, but if you haven't, then to sum it up very, very quickly, Anne Frank was a Jewish girl born into a Jewish family, and when the war started to happen and things started to get more restricted and more intense and people were getting taken away, Anne and her family, and also others that accompanied them with time, went into hiding in her father's workplace behind a bookshelf in a secret annex, or a little secret apartment building if you like. And whilst Anne was in hiding, she started writing a diary, and this book is a compilation of her diary entries that she wrote from start to finish. And I'm not going to spoil the ending, but that's essentially what it is. I think for me, a key component that made me really connected to this book was the fact that before reading it, I'd been to Amsterdam and I'd been to the Anne Frank's house museum in Amsterdam, and so as she's describing parts of the house within her diaries, I could visualise them. This is also the first piece that I've ever read about Anne Frank and by Anne Frank herself, and I have to say, she wrote this when she was a young teenager, and I was incredibly shocked by the level of self-awareness that she demonstrated, by the level of maturity, by the way that she handled situations and handled her circumstances that she was unfairly handled in life. I was really shocked by her outlook, and it's definitely something that I took inspiration from myself, because I didn't expect that when I started reading this book. So that was definitely a factor of this book that made it go up in my rankings. The thing that made it come down a little bit was that because it was a diary collection, I felt that there was a little bit of a lack of history, and I think I might have preferred to read an edition where alongside the diary entries there was a bit more factual history with them, just so that it could really piece things together for me. I don't know if there's an edition out there that does that. If there is, I might be interested in giving that a read at another time, but I think that's what was missing for me, and so because of that I rated it 3 out of 5 stars. But overall, a really important book for everyone to read once they hit an appropriate age and can properly understand the topics, and I would recommend this to anyone. Next up, we have another favourite of mine from 2022, and this is In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park. And what this book is, it follows the author as a North Korean defector and describes her journey and her family's journey from North Korea to other parts of the world. The book is split into 3 sections, so it describes their life before, it describes their life during their escape, and it describes their life afterwards. And I think that for me, that split made it a really approachable read. And before reading this book, I didn't really have much knowledge on the subject. I was going in quite blindly, but for me this book was incredibly horrific. It was insightful and it was inspiring. Those are the 3 words that I use to describe it on my Goodreads, and those are the 3 words that I will stick by. Apologies if the camera angle has moved or I have moved. My battery just died because I've been talking for so long and I had to change it for another one. But I think I said most of what I needed to say about this book. Overall, it is one that I would recommend to anyone that's interested in learning more about this subject, and I think it's a really good introduction to it. I literally think that this is a scratch on the surface, and we're probably going to see lots more books like this in the years to come, and I gave this 4 out of 5 stars overall. But the next up we have When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. The book is split into 2 parts again. The first half explores the author's experiences in neurosurgery. I can't believe I'm saying that again. I've only just realised how many neurosurgery books I've read this year, but this is again another one, and it explores his experiences as a doctor at the start, and then in the second half it explores his experiences on the other side as a patient. And so I found this really interesting, learning again about neurosurgery but also listening to his thoughts alongside it. The only downside to this book is that I actually wished it was a little bit longer. You know, if it was around that 300-page mark, I feel like it could have gone a little bit more in depth about the deeper topics within the book. It was incredibly captivating and it was an emotional read, but I feel like it could have been more emotional and more of a book where I could learn and grow from if it was another 100 pages longer. And that's the reason why I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. But if you're interested in reading this type of book, if you already read them, if you want to read a popular one, I would 100% recommend this because it is a good read, especially if you can pick it up for £3. And then last but not least, we have reached my final read of 2022, and it's called The Heat of the Moment by Sabrina Cohen Hatton. Again, another Waterstone sale find. This was £3 in the sale, and I picked it up because, if you cannot tell, it was slightly different from my usual read. I found that at the start of the book my attention was really gripped. I found it really interesting, and again I learned a lot from it because it's a side of life and experience that I've not really delved into very much before. But I did find that towards the end of the book my attention did drop, and that's not because I have a short attention span like with some of the other books, but it's because there was a very heavy focus on how to succeed and how to improve as a commander within the firefighting service. And as someone that's not really within that, it was a little bit hard to relate to, and I just found it a little bit boring towards the end, and I found myself craving those stories of actual firefighting that little bit more rather than how to improve within the workforce. But again, not a reflection on the book at all, just a reflection on my personal preferences and my expectations of this book. But overall I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars, and if you're interested in switching it up a little bit, this is a great one to do it with. And if you're interested in the firefighting service or you work within it and you want to know more about your decision making and how to improve, I can imagine that this would would be a really effective and really useful book for you to take some notes from. But those are all of the books that I read in 2022. Like I say, there weren't absolutely loads there was only 16, hence why I went into quite a bit of detail about all of them. I do really hope you enjoyed listening to my reviews, to my reflections of these books. If you've seen any that you like and you think you're gonna read, then do comment down below and let me know which ones, because I would love to get a conversation going about all of my reads. I love that. Also, let me know what your favourite reads of 2022 are. If you've got any books that you'd like to recommend for me, I am 100% open to suggestions and would love to hear them. And other than that, I'm going to bring this video swiftly to a close in the hope that I film another one of these next year with my reading goal finished of 20 books for 2023. So if you would like to see that, then do make sure you subscribe so you can stick around. And other than that, just thank you very much for watching and listening to me ramble, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon in my next video. Thanks and goodbye.